Hello everyone, welcome to the Yogascapes in Japan podcast series. My name is Amy McCartney. Yogascapes in Japan is a 2-year project funded by the Japanese Society for the Promotion of Science and is hosted by the Graduate School of Global Environmental Studies at Kyoto University, Japan. The aim of this project is to understand and document the popularity and consumption of global yoga within the Japanese cultural setting. Today's episode is part 4 of 4 from the Penn State Symposium on Yoga, Ethics and Neoliberalism. In April 2019, thanks to the Rock Ethics Institute, Dr. Jeremy Engels organised and moderated a stimulating day of public discussions amongst 4 of the world's leading scholars of modern yoga. Today's episode features Drs. Anya Foxen from California Polytechnic State University, Andrea Jane from Indiana University, Purdue University, Krista Coolberry from Yoga Alliance, and Patrick McCartney from Kyoto University. Panel 3 is about yoga as training to be a citizen of the world.
Thanks for coming out on this really rainy, cold afternoon. Thanks to all of you who've been here all day, and thanks to all of you who just came out for this last session. It's great that you're here. And we've had a really productive and wide-ranging conversation over many issues related to contemporary yoga today. And we have this last hour and a half, which I titled our panel, Yoga as Training to be a Citizen of the World. And I don't know what that means.
Sounds good.
But no, I would love to hear what people think about that. And I also would like to leave about the last 30 minutes or so for questions. Questions that have come up either from yesterday's talk or from the panels today, or questions that the panelists have for each other too, actually. So if there are any big questions that you all would like to hear what others have to say about, we've got some time for that. But I think the question that I'd love to open with, Krista was just asking, why don't you open with it? What about that?
I was just asking, is the role of yoga in the contemporary world social justice oriented?
Can you
Should it be?
say that a little louder?
Should yoga be social justice oriented? Is it inherently in the contemporary context? That's a question.
Yeah.
I don't think it inherently is. There's nothing about yoga that lends it to social justice. But I think everything should be social justice oriented. But that's just my own value system. I love and justice, whatever we can do for the sake of love and justice. But whether that's like the way we eat, the way we educate, the way we work, every area of life. So I don't think there's anything.
You don't think it's inherently?
I don't think it's a yoga thing.
Well, is yoga inherently anything?
Right, which is
We just
something
have
we already
to
asked.
What is yoga?
Yeah, that I don't think it is. So there's nothing in it that there's no essential quality that lends it to social justice or means it ought to be about social justice any more than anything else.
Right.
Well, if we've talked today about we've determined that it's very difficult to define what yoga is, and mindfulness, and meditation. That in fact we're always defining those terms in various ways against other terms. We're building boundaries. So yoga, did you say yoga is what we say it is? Is that what you said?
Yoga is what yoga practitioners say.
Yeah. If we say that yoga should be about social justice or about some kind of justice or love, how and in what way? What does that actually look like? I'm curious what you all think.
Well, Krista, you're at the forefront of trying to make this happen.
Yeah,
So
that's why I asked the question.
But what are your priorities, and how do you answer this for yourself?
I think for myself and for the seats that I sit in, so I'm the Vice President of Standards for Yoga Alliance, and I was speaking to Matthew Sanford last week, who is an accessible yoga teacher, and he teaches yoga to people with like cerebral palsy and full paralysis, and does it from like the subtle body part, and so has that lens that he looks through. And he asked me, and he was like, is what you're trying to do at Yoga Alliance like social justice? Is that the role of yoga? And so that's why I wanted to ask you that. But from our perspective, it is the role of yoga as union. Therefore, the idea of bringing in the diversity into the unity space, right? And so really thinking about not only being justice and love oriented, but in action, in awareness, in education, in where we put our money, and how we spend our money, and how we spend our members' money, and thinking about that as if it is about love, which I would agree that, or think that yoga should be about that, self-love, love of all things, then we need to, and if you have the platform like I'm lucky enough to have, with 100,000 members in 149 countries and stuff like that, then I do think that it's a responsibility of us to live into the justice love space. And that's why, they have difficulties in having conversations around like diversity, accessibility, inclusivity, equity, making sure that we are providing both resources and funding to bring yoga into populations where it hasn't been before, and making sure that the people that are teaching those are also part of those communities as well. And so all of that takes resources, but is also very much, from my perspective, what we need to be if we're talking about yoga as human and for everyone. Yeah. What do you think, Anya? About social justice and yoga?
I mean, yeah, I'm inclined to agree that like everything should serve the interests of social justice, right? So far as yoga is part of everything, right? Like it should, right? Because everything should. Yeah, I wonder. How do I say this? I mean, just because of where I'm at in my head right now with trying to like define yoga and figure out like what do we mean when we say yoga today, right? And how does that change depending on the context? I'm just really trying to like kind of look for ways to have these conversations in more precise ways, right? So I think to think about like what would it look like for yoga to be social justice oriented, right? Like, doesn't that depend on what the yoga is? Like what are we doing when we do yoga? If we're doing posture, right? Like that may mean something about like trauma sensitivity, right? Like there's a set of concerns that comes into effect there. If we're talking about, just spaces, maybe festival culture or something, right? Then there's like a different range of concerns. Yeah, so I guess maybe what I'm trying to work through is like how yoga, quote unquote, is related to context, and how the context that it exists in really sort of changes, like what our concerns and our priorities are, and right, like how we even talk about what we're doing. I don't know. It all sounds very
I think
big and
context
abstract,
is incredibly important, because it's not like yoga has always been social justice oriented. I mean, you think about like the antinomian and like go be an individual and live in the forest and meditate and work on your own liberation. But I think in the global context that we live in now, and thinking about that and the conversations that we have to have and are necessary, and what yoga can lend itself to, I do think it's a responsibility from where I sit.
Well, it sounds all good to like increase diversity and all that, but a lot of times in multicultural societies we end up with these ghettos, right?
Right. You don't want to play in neoliberalism, right?
I think the same thing can happen in yoga spaces as well. You get your subculture of yoga and that. So that's not really increasing diversity in the way that the social justice oriented mind kind of thinks. So you have to kind of step back a bit and go, how do we address that issue before we can get to the social justice issue? I'm not sure. I don't know.
Well, right, and that, and inclusivity versus diversity, and equity versus inclusivity, and working towards equity as the goal, but then that's also...
And I think about the rhetoric that you hear a lot in your classes, maybe at the end of the class, like, oh, you're complete, you're whole, you're where you need to be. It's like, that's not really kind of pushing people forward necessarily.
Be revolutionary.
Yeah, right? You become a docile consumer instead of an active citizen, in a sense. I mean, that's where it can end.
Right.
I'm not saying that's what it is all the time. So, and then a lot of people go to yoga class because they want their world to be re-enchanted with some sort of magic, right? So if you start talking about politics and like taking down Trump, or ending the cholera epidemic in Yemen, or I remember one guy teaching a yoga class once started talking about like taxation during like the yoga nidra session of the class. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about taxation for? Like, I've come here to relax, So, I mean, I think so you're going to get some people who are keen for that activism within the yoga class, and then others who aren't. So then you've got to figure out who your clients are and what your market is.
And multiple paths of different kinds of yogis too, right? So for some, they might be more karma yogis if you're going to continue to go into like those type of spaces, and for others, bhakti yogis. And
so maybe you just have to, if you're a yoga teacher, you just have to like do what you're doing, and if it's activism and focusing on that, then you're going to draw those people that are also employed towards that. Let the people who want to just bliss out and eat, pray, love type of stuff, they can find that somewhere else. And, I mean, you start trying to cater to all these different things, you're probably going to just end up with a cake that no one wants a slice of, right? So that's how I think about it. So it can be justice oriented and not. Yoga's just a tool, right? I mean, like a knife. You can kill someone with it or save someone's life. I mean, that's what I kind of think about. Not that I'm trying to kill someone with yoga,
but you could.
I mean, it's got multiple uses, so just like yoga.
Thank you. I just literally wanted to think about that out loud. People think about things.
Could I ask you to introduce the panelists?
Oh.
Since I wasn't here
Of
earlier.
course.
Thank you.
Oh, it's my
Put it
pleasure.
into context for us. Thank you.
Would you all mind introducing yourselves?
Sure. I'm Andrea Jan. I'm an associate professor at Indiana University in Indianapolis, and my field is religious studies.
Okay.
So I'm interested in yoga, and so far as yoga and especially popular culture helps us understand religion in contemporary society. So we can think about larger themes around the creation of religious spaces and practices to resolve problems of weakness and suffering, and shared ontologies and worldviews and ritual and all of these kinds of religious dimensions through the yoga industry. And so that's where a lot of my work is.
I'm Anya Foxon. I'm an assistant professor of religious studies and women's and gender studies at Cal Poly in California. So I guess technically I'm also a religious studies person. That's my background in terms of my degree and kind of where I'm at disciplinarily. I focus a little bit more on history, or at least I have been. We'll see where it goes from here. So what I'm really interested in and what I've been working on is kind of trying to figure out how modern yoga got to be modern yoga. And so kind of examining some of the the ingredients and the dynamics that go into that. So conceptually, I look at gender, and I look at kind of how the language of science is used to kind of modernize what we think about yoga as doing.
I'm Krista Kuberi. I am currently the Vice President of Standards at Yoga Alliance, which is the credentialing body for yoga teachers and yoga schools. I was previously, I'm also a religious studies background. I wrote my dissertation on the identity of American yoga. I've also been a yoga practitioner for about 20 years. I was a yoga teacher and a yoga teacher trainer, as well as a scholar before I took my current position.
My name is Patrick McCartney. I am at Kyoto University in Japan. I have a research project called Yogascapes in Japan. And I'm interested in that project. I have a few projects, but this one is looking at how global yoga is reconstituted within the Japanese consumer space. So I'm interested. I'm an anthropologist primarily, I think, some days. And what I'm interested in. How to put it? Well, I work principally, I think, on tourism, wellness tourism, and spiritual tourism. So yoga has a big part to play in the multi-trillion-dollar global wellness industry. So I'm interested in how yoga and also Sanskrit are used to create demand, to sort of work between these two poles of the politics of imagination and the economics of desire. So I'm interested in how Sanskrit and yoga, I'm interested in the biographies of Sanskrit and yoga and how they are used, instrumentalized, particularly by the Indian state to brand India, and how it's used as a soft power instrument of the Indian state. So I look very much at how the Indian government creates the narratives and the origin myths of yoga and this, and then how these stories are then transmitted throughout the marketing of global yoga as well too. So I think that's what I do. Only on Thursdays.
Today's Friday.
Today's Friday.
That's why I'm here.
My name is Jeremy Engels. I'm an associate professor of rhetoric and ethics here at Penn State. And I'm so happy that you all are here. We have one more hour of discussion together, which is great. And the question I would love to hear all of your reflections on, and then we can see if there are any other questions that have come up that are pressing for all of you, and we can throw it open to the audience and see if they have any questions. In my experience of teaching yoga and owning a yoga studio, I think that a lot of people come to yoga, and I believe this, and maybe it's naive, I don't know, but I think that people genuinely actually would like to make the world a better place. I think sometimes they don't know how to do that, and I feel like sometimes as yoga teachers we could do a better job of actually instructing our students in how to do that and what that might mean, right? And so I'm curious for all of you, how can we turn yoga towards channeling that good energy towards something productive? Not productive. That word is much too neoliberal. Towards something maybe revolutionary. Towards something that reorients the way that we relate to ourselves and towards others and towards the world in which we live. And I guess maybe sub-question is, do you think that's possible or not? And maybe sub-question, do you think that's desirable? No, I'm kidding. So I'm curious if that question resonates with any of you.
I'm a bit pessimistic.
Fair enough.
I don't really see an emancipatory potential. I'm looking for it.
Sure.
Yeah, but I mean, yoga to me, in this current state it is, it's just something else that people can do.
I think that there can be, and there have been examples of ways that the individual going into the yoga community and then creating community from that space can be a revolutionary act and can lead to change, if you will. I also am skeptical that that's what often happens.
Fair.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm probably more focused on, there's this thing that we do that we call yoga, right? Mm-hmm. And focused on doing that thing in just and equitable ways, rather than, just because I don't know what it would look like, right, to sort of use yoga as a tool for, like social justice and equity. Because I think there are better tools for that, right? I mean, protest, all sorts of stuff that fall under the umbrella of activism. I'm not sure that yoga is activism, right? I think it's something else.
but I think that we can do it, right? Like as what it is in better and more responsible ways.
But there are like the off the mats and stuff like that. So using yoga as a tool towards social justice for greater good, but not necessarily like the asana, not like you're just standing there. Although there are people that say that you just meditate, you're making the world better because you're putting out different energetic vibes. So,
Yeah, well, and so that stuff, like, I don't know that I call that yoga.
Right, like what
It's like yoga adjacent, right? It's what you might do with communities that kind of cluster around, like this practice that we're all involved in, right? But I think that like that's like going out into the world and the off the mat stuff. It's off the mat, right? Like if you want to say everything is yoga, well,
which is
fine,
some people argue, right? It's the whole thing.
Yeah, it's just not how I would talk about it, I guess.
And I can say for myself, yoga has changed my life and made me a better person. So that's something. For me, not for any of you, but like if you feel like it has changed you, like is that revolutionary in of itself?
Yeah, I wonder if
Yes.
Yeah, I think there was a book that was published, it's been probably 20 or 25 years ago, called Bowling Alone. I don't know if you all know that book. It was a study, I think he was an economist, wasn't he? Or is he a sociologist, right? But he was basically studying American participation in voluntary organizations over the last 100 years or so, but especially over the last 20 or 30 years. And he showed pretty convincingly in that book that there's been a hollowing out of American participation in civic or voluntary organizations. Church participation's gone down. A lot of the kinds of clubs that were really popular in earlier parts of American history, participation has also dropped. And in some ways, that actually, we could argue that is a good thing, because those clubs were really exclusionary and xenophobic at times. But if neoliberalism is something that obliterates the social and it explodes these spaces of connection, it seems like one thing that yoga can potentially do that is at least a step towards change is bring people together. Maybe it does that in ways that itself is exclusionary, and that's something we have to really question and interrogate. But it seems like to me that is a necessary step for change, is to actually get people in the same place. And I'm curious.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything in yoga, like I said, that lends itself to social justice. But sure, I mean, just like any other shared practice, it can be a political space, in a space for political activism. So, just like when people are united through their shared theological beliefs and a shared church institution, and they protest together, right? So we can kind of, if you're asking like how can yoga be a social justice space, well, we look at history and find like the ways in which political activism is effective, and then yoga communities engage in those kinds of activities. So in other words, we just learn from people who have already done it. It doesn't matter if they were doing yoga. What matters is whether they were politically effective.
Yeah, question?
Yeah, so I was wondering if any of these think that there is a connection between yoga and violence activism, such as violence by Gandhi and
So connection between yoga and
violence activism.
and nonviolence. Yeah, what do you all make of ahimsa?
There's nothing in ahimsa that lends itself to social justice, actually, because ahimsa can be interpreted in various different ways and has been throughout South Asian religious history. So some have interpreted ahimsa to mean that you should withdraw from the world entirely. Not pursue social justice, but withdraw from society. And, others have interpreted it as a sort of a cessation of bodily action entirely, right? So, I mean, there's so many different ways of interpreting ahimsa. And if you define nonviolence in a sort of social justice sense, then sure, then you could teach that in your particular yoga space, and it be a shared value in that space. But there's nothing inherently taken, so that's what people make of it.
I guess also, activist burnout, right? So you could be working for the betterment of the world, but then there's the violence that is you're directing towards yourself, right? Not self-caring or doing these things. So there are different types of violence, right? Or different types of ahimsa.
Yeah.
So then you start complicating it, and it's not such a simple thing as yoga and ahimsa are these two things. The Bhagavad Gita happened on it's a war, right?
Is it?
No, it is not.
No, yeah, exactly. There is the battlefield.
Yeah, right. So there's violence.
Right. Yes.
And the context, I guess, right? At that period of time where violence was more prevalent in the life of every day between people. Looking back at that period of time, how the life was, what was around, how did they communicate with each other?
Yeah.
Violence was part of their life, survival.
I think we've just shipped it offshore, right? Today.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
sanitized our frame to think we're less violent.
Yeah.
Don't know if we're more or less violent.
Christina?
I know that sometimes people try to separate yoga and mindfulness or whatever, however you want to call it, but one of the theories is that doing the asanas or yoga will create some mindfulness, or at least quiet the mind a little, because you're focusing on the body, and then there's also this meditation, which is could be part of mindfulness. But I had a yoga teacher previously to Yoga Lab, and he was from India but had lived in LA for several decades. And his company, and I don't know which company it was, but he and others in the company would go into juvenile detention centers and work with the men, I believe the young men, and they actually tracked it, and statistics showed that the recidivism went down drastically. So that might be a way of, like social activism in a bit, to reach out in that way using those sorts of, I don't know what sort of yoga they did exactly, but it was asanas and probably meditation and that sort of thing. So I view that as at least helping society. So,
We talked about that a little bit, I think, the last panel, but this idea of, I think a lot of I wrote a paper a couple years ago on yoga in prisons, and one of the common quotes from the people that got out was like, I really loved yoga because they taught me the tools, but then I could do it myself, right? Like, you don't have to always go somewhere else to get the yoga, and like that in of itself, I think, is in some ways equitable in the fact that, like, okay, so you have a small cell and you have very little resources, and yet you can still be able to calm your mind. You can still be able to not end up back in jail because you are less reactionary and all of those things. And I think, yes, but we also need more than just that.
Right. But
I would resist linking reducing recidivism with social justice, because I think that, again, we're putting the burden on individuals to stay out of prison when we know that whether or not you end up in prison has a lot more to do with your race and your class than it does with your individual choices.
Right.
And so if we reduce recidivism, that might have more to do with forcing someone to conform to a particular set of cultural values and norms, and that are less resistant and revolutionary. And I'm not sure if that's working towards social justice, because it doesn't challenge the oppressive system of the prison industrial complex, which I think is the greatest perpetrator of crime. If we're going to talk about, perpetrator of violence.
Are there other questions?
Did you talk earlier about personal spiritualism and how yoga impacts that, and then how that might impact social justice? Or did I miss that?
I don't think we've talked about spirituality much.
We haven't really.
Yeah. What do you mean by spiritualism?
Well, part of, for me, the aspect of yoga is inner exploration. Time to think about not just my body, but my emotions and my, the way I present myself to the world, and to try and hone the more benevolent aspects of life. So I would hope that if others are using yoga in that way, that there's more benevolence, which would lead to more social justice. But that's from my perspective, and as someone who practices, studies religion and spirituality, I just want to put that out there to see if you have any thoughts about that.
I'd be interested to hear what Anna and Jeremy's experience is in terms as the leaders of a sort of spiritual institution. I mean, I tend to, the frameworks I work with kind of see yoga studios as spiritual institutions. And so I'd be interested in hearing you all comment on your experience teaching yoga and running in such an institution, with the intention being to make the world a better place. Do you see that there's a connection between sort of spiritual transformation in that space and becoming a better person? Or has it been effective?
What do you think?
Pitch it to you. Start.
I think that's such a good question, and I think that running a yoga studio and being around a yoga studio, I see at least in our community, and I'm not going to make any claims that our community is necessarily representative of other communities. So our community is what our community is, and I like our community. But it is what it is, right? But I think that there is a really strong desire amongst people to connect more deeply to sources of meaning that are beyond neoliberalism, beyond market values, beyond some sort of discourse that tries to squeeze every ounce of our being out into productivity, right? And I think that there's also a genuine interest in living more compassionate lives. And compassion actually is one of the words that I hear a lot. I hear love and justice and nonviolence and whatnot, but compassion to me is a really powerful word, actually. And I've seen now, we've run our studio for 3 years, and I've talked with a number of students who, by practicing regularly the kinds of yoga that we teach, feel better able to live more compassionate lives. And so, to me, I think they did that work themselves, actually. It wasn't us who did that work, but we created a space in which people could do that work themselves. And so I do think that I don't think it's automatic, right? I don't think it's that, okay, I did a handstand this week and now I'm a better person, right? I mean, but I do think that sitting with yourself and observing yourself and your tendencies and noticing your reactivities, right? Triggers.
Forgiveness for not being able to do that handstand.
Yeah, well, I think that becomes, at least in the kinds of classes that I teach at the studio and that Anna teaches, I mean, forgiveness is a big part of, that's one of the ways that we fight against responsibilization, like that. I'm responsible for every bad thought that I have, and everything that I've done bad in my life is my fault, and I'm a terrible person, and we got to let go of all of that stuff. And look outward to building bonds, I think. And so, You know, and I also want to kick this to Laura over
I
there.
want to kick it to
And
Kristen,
to
another
Kristen,
co-owner
too.
of the
Yeah, I would
studio
say
here. So-
Kristen owns the yoga studio with us, and
We have some
Laura
other great
teaches
teachers here.
charity classes at the studio, and probably is the most philanthropic, socially justice-minded human being that I know. You're up there, so. But I mean, I'd be interested in hearing what any of the ladies have to say. Awesome people.
Well, Kristen also has done a lot of yoga
Yes, she has.
charity work as well. I don't know. I don't know if it's like drinking the Kool-Aid that like I'm not a pessimist about it. Like I do feel that the way that we practice and teach is meaningful to individuals in enabling them to make those compassionate choices. It has nothing to do with handstand. You know, yeah. But, and I think people want that. Like I think people want to be empowered to make those kind of decisions. And again, it's not the spiritual gangster pants, you know, but if I can teach a class and you can put in whatever you can afford and, you know, collectively that goes to some other, like, to a nonprofit doing that social justice work, or I'll plug my 6 p.m. class tonight. We already have, you know, and again, it's a small drip in the bucket, but it's what I can do. It's what I can manage. I can't personally write like a, you know, $10,000 check, but, you know, I'm approaching that with my yoga fundraising because that's what I can do. And so 6 p.m. tonight, all the to helping feed and establish local families legally seeking asylum from Central America. So working with immigrant families together, and my friend and her advisor I'm also friends with, it's part of her master's in social work. So again, I see community, sorry, I have a lot to say about this now. I see community as, you know, that fabric that we all collectively are the threads of. And so,
Yeah, one thing you said, Laura, I think I hung up on Andrea, your talk on yesterday was just so interesting, and that I think people want to be empowered. But the thing about neoliberalism is it tricks us, right? Like it tricks us into false kinds of empowerment. That these little consumer choices that we make somehow are empowering us to change the world, when in fact they're actually reinforcing the system that we're trying to change. And so maybe one of the things we can do in our yoga practices or teaching is actually empower people in ways that are resistive or transgressive or compassionate. But then I'm not even convinced necessarily that that's just unique to yoga anymore after today, actually. I mean, I think if we can enact that in yoga spaces, and I think that's what we're really trying to do, is that uniquely yoga, I'm not convinced that it is necessarily anymore, but I don't think it's opposed to our yoga either, actually. But like Cristina said, I think there is something about the yoga also that can help with this kind of cultivation of compassion.
well, there have been studies, who knows how flawed they are, but then again, like yoga makes you more compassionate. So there's, you know, with the changes of the brain that we talked about earlier and stuff, it lends itself to that by the practice, just living the practice. And being more empathetic to yourself and more compassionate to yourself, which sounds like maybe is what you get on the mat, also lends itself to being more compassionate to others. So, you know, it's... And I do know a whole lot of yoga studios that do charity classes and give back to communities and really are invested in their communities. And so part of what I'm hoping to do, you know, as far as having the platform that I have, is to bring it back into the communities, because I think that's what matters, right? Like, it's one thing for me to make proclamations from on high, or to say, like, here's some money into this community, and this is what I think that you should do with this money because this is what I'm offering, instead of saying, this is your community, what do you need, and how are you going to support each other, and how can you do it together? I think that's a very different way of approaching that conversation, too.
It's still kind of reactionary, not revolutionary, right?
Well, that would be, but they can be revolutionary from the ground up, and I don't have to be the
Yeah.
You know, the person on high. It's like, this is the revolution I decided on.
Right.
Do it together.
I wonder if it's one thing that I've found really interesting in contemporary conversations about American democracy is that, and scholars have shown how this has happened over the last 100 years, especially over the last 20 or 30 years, where there's been this shift of attention to national elections, especially the elections that happen every 4 years, our presidential election. And we forget actually that democracy really is lived on a local level, and that so many of the micro choices that we make on our local level, there are local elections happening all the time, there are local positions that need to be filled, and actually so much more good work can be done on the local level that can ever be done by casting a vote in a presidential election. Not to say that that's not important, because it is. It's so important, especially in Pennsylvania. But I think it might be a similar kind of thing where maybe we need to be focused on our local communities, which isn't to say that the broader ecosystem doesn't matter, right?
It's the global. Global and local.
The glocal?
Yeah.
Local. Yeah. New word.
It's a nice portmanteau.
It is.
So you're advocating for some type of anarchist-like local community.
No, I hadn't really thought of it in those terms necessarily. Maybe. I mean, I think we have the most control over our environment together on local scale, which is not to say total control, because it's not, right? I mean, the decisions that people make in New York City about emissions actually impact what happens in Pennsylvania, because emissions travel. And that's part of a larger system that privileges fossil fuels. And so it's all bound up in all of that. But advocating for Penn State to get its power from renewable resources actually is a decision that makes a lot of difference, right? I mean, does it change the world? No, but it actually, I think it's quite significant. And it's interesting to me that that's where our conversation on yoga has gone. That's pretty cool, actually.
Well, I mean, you see it in the sense of, like, say, India instrumentalizing yoga for particular agendas. So it can be used, to shape discourse and the outcomes that can come from that. So why can't that happen on a local level? Charity classes begin with that. I guess it's up to us to get creative, right? Figure out something.
Sounds like fun.
Let's do it. Let's be gangsters.
Says the pessimist.
Spiritual gangsters.
One way I can see how yoga in particular is affecting the local culture, for me anyway, and probably others, is that it's one of the most diverse environments we encounter all week long. Yeah. Yeah. Well, no babies, but pets, right?
Kristen's babies sometimes.
Okay, there you go. But different cultures and, ages. So I like it. I think that's empowering right there. And that makes a difference when people who are from different backgrounds, different ages, different cultures, or whatever come together to do something. I think that's pretty special.
But not all yoga studios have the space to kind of create community, right? I mean, thinking about Japan specifically here, because the space is a real issue. But, so I mean, part of my field work is I'll go to a yoga class, and I hope to then be able to talk to people. But they just all leave, because there's no space to kind of hang out. Or, everyone's kind of got their own ritual prior to the yoga class. Some people want to go and sit on the mat, meditate, lie down. Every kind of studio is different, right? There's a culture for each studio, so it gets really hard to sometimes build community in a yoga class or studio because everyone's rushing in class, rushing out. So, yeah, then I think it comes down to these local cultures still. I mean, what does the studio owner want to do? What's the intention behind the studio? Is it to make money? Is it to fund, endless travel to ideal destinations? Or is it to build a local community? So, we have to get creative.
I think that's one of the nice things that we do tend to do in our studio as well, is to create that space and openness for people to talk to each other before and after a class, and explicitly say, go ahead and turn to the right or left or behind you and meet your neighbor, especially when you're in this packed little space with mats close to each other. It's nice, actually, to get to know the person that you're packed sitting next to. Some wonderful conversations and friendships can sometimes come out of that. Again, with people who might not otherwise have an opportunity to meet and talk to each other. And I think that's something we try to help facilitate.
So it has to be on the onus of both, like their whatever, but the fact that you are intentionally creating a community that is a community, right? That isn't just about coming in and getting your workout or your sweat on and then leaving, right? It's like, what, how else are we showing up for ourselves, but also showing up for each other?
Well, I think as Andrea was saying, right, there's something kind of intrinsic about yoga that makes that happen. That's something that you are making happen in your community, in your space, right? And it's kind of centered around this idea and practice of yoga. But yeah, I go to essentially a corporate studio in Santa Barbara. It's probably the least diverse place that I'm in all week, and that's saying a lot because Santa Barbara is not very diverse, right? And yeah, nobody really talks. They're not sure on space, right? If they wanted to have community and conversations, it could happen. It just doesn't, because that's not what that space is about, right? And so if you don't build it, it doesn't automatically happen, right? So the yoga won't do it for you.
Right. It's about the leaders, the guides.
I wonder about, I'm just thinking about my own experience practicing as part of a sangha or part of a community. And to me, there's something about people breathing together. That's different than, all right, we're all going to get together and play Settlers of Catan. Or we're all going to get together and, I don't know, what do people get together
CrossFit,
and do?
it's different.
Yeah.
I think choirs.
Sure, yeah, maybe like the raising of voices together or something like that.
That's also great.
Well, that's my whole argument. Right?
That's right. That's also the breath, right? Yeah, when you sing and sharing of that.
Yeah, which yoga doesn't own the breath, right? I mean,
what?
that's my takeaway quote from the conference. Yoga doesn't own the breath, but the breath is a big part of yoga, right? And there's something about that kind of somatic community, right? That I think, again, isn't just yoga. There are probably other examples of that. But I think there is something powerful about communities that are founded on that shared breath, right?
And on intention, right? Because you can
Sure.
breathe, right? We're all breathing right now. You can breathe automatically. If you don't breathe, you're going to die. So that happens. But when you walk into a space and you consciously breathe, something different. So when you walk into a space and it's conscious community created, and then you also have that moment of shared spirit, because this is the etymology of spirit breath, right? Then it changes the dynamic, right? So I think
It's also the synchronous moving in a group.
Yeah.
right.
So there's three things: moving together in a group, the deep breathing, and some contemplative thing, and they create this yoga stone,
The bob.
right?
Right.
And
Effervescence.
Yeah.
Apparently, there's a whole vocabulary to describe what it is.
There is. There's all sorts of
Yeah, that's interesting. What are our different words for that? You all just said three of them really fast.
Well, mine is Durkheim, right?
Oh, you call it
Collective
Durkheim?
effervescence.
Collective
No, I know.
effervescence.
Collective effervescence. Yeah. Just call it Emile Durkheim.
I said the bob.
Collective effervescence. You said what?
Bob, like the vibe, the feeling, the word that can't be. It's like a word that's like the experience
Right.
of the collective.
Would you say yoga stone?
It's a real thing.
especially if you go to weed yoga.
There is Stoga.
Actually, where do we see the Ganja Yoga studio? Where
Not
is that?
It wasn't here.
Toronto,
Is that Toronto?
or was it Edmonton?
Edmonton?
No, it was Vancouver.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Ganja Yoga studio. Apparently it was in Vancouver.
There's lots in Colorado.
So, I mean, in Japan, there's none of that. Actually, it's really interesting when you talk to, like, no one in Japan has heard about like weed yoga or goat yoga or snake yoga or any of these things. Penguin yoga. They haven't heard about it.
Penguin yoga?
Yeah. You can do yoga with penguins.
Oh.
Yeah,
More with goats.
Exactly. But it's all pretty heretical to just about everyone I've asked. No one thinks, oh, that could be fun. It's like, no, it's not. Yeah.
But then there's the argument, like in the past, traditional, they practiced outside and there were animals. So really, it's, and I'm like, wait, what? There is that argument.
I'm not sure how we got there.
Yeah.
The mind tends
We've
to
been here since
wander.
9.
Are there other questions?
About this
It does not have to be about goat yoga.
We don't even know where we are, so yes, please.
Has anyone done goat yoga? Done it? That's true.
It was research.
How do you do goat yoga?
There's
right.
goats
Yeah.
walking around while you do yoga.
Well, mine was very non-commercial. It was at my colleague's intentional community, and so they have, they're on this. They've got like a little plot of land and like a house and like other structures built up around, and they have goats, right? That they like get milk from, and every spring, I guess the goats have more goats. So you can they're larger goats, right? But the little baby ones you can do the goat yoga with. Although, they they hop around, they hop on you. They really like to do that. They also sometimes pee on you, which is, whatever you want to do with that.
Clean it.
Yeah.
I mean, cow urine, I guess, is very Suffolk, right? Goat urine, maybe not so much.
Not as much. Yeah. That's a phenomenon. But that goes to like the branding and the individual and the entrepreneurial spirit, right? It's like, oh, but everybody has to have their own thing that they do, right? So there's like, there's broga, there's stoga, there's naked slackline yoga, there's, anything that you could think of, and just like putting the descriptor yoga on it because that's trendy does not therefore make it yoga.
Well,
No.
Or it does.
Or it does, according to your,
Yeah, but there's nothing else that makes it yoga except for that it's called yoga.
Right.
Right.
It's an empty signifier.
So, whether you're with goats or cats or getting high, there's some prototypical qualities of a yoga class. So it's not totally empty.
That's true, I guess, yeah.
I think in terms of, sorry.
Oh, that's good. I was
I
just
know
going to say that, it's just so context specific too. So, in Denver and Vancouver, you've got Stoga, but in Indianapolis, you have beer yoga.
Right.
And it just goes to show, like any cultural practice, when it moves from one social space to another, it's going to morph to some extent to reflect those that particular context, society and social values and resources and norms.
It's beyond the reach of any human handler.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, there isn't that, yeah.
But some people think that all these different syncretic forms of yoga are heretical, which literally they are. But, I think about the death metal yoga, right? You can get up there and, do your warrior pose, like, into like some Slayer or Slipknot or something.
You can.
Right? Now,
Can you do that again? I'm just... I zoomed out. Thank you.
But, that's giving an opportunity for people who are probably really weirded out by normal yoga, right? And then that gives them an entry to explore yoga and then to get more mindful.
It's like the gateway drug.
Yeah, it's a gateway. Yoga's a gateway drug. For sure.
No, we're starting to sound like Candy Brown now.
Oh, yes. I don't want to be, no.
I have a question. So when we talk like yoga goes and morphs into the culture of different, but there are like, if we look at Ashtanga yoga or or anger, which are more on a devotional, and they really do not merge. They don't morph in different ways. They're still much more stricter. Does that mean like they're more yoga than this one is yoga? So
If you
that's
ask them, yes.
yeah. Okay. Can you elaborate?
I mean, there is just like they, and I think that's the difference when we look at what happens in modern postural yoga, moving of yoga, transactions of yoga. There are lineages that stay somewhat true to their lineage as far as always going back to their founder, going back to especially Ashtanga where there's a set sequence, the primary series, secondary series, that doesn't change. But so they can say that they are authentic to that space and then therefore hold themselves as more yogic. But then there's still going to be conversations about where did that yoga come from? Where did Krishnamacharya's yoga come from? Because if Pattabhi Joy started Ashtanga and Iyengar was also a student of Krishnamacharya, where was his location and how was he, mixing wrestling and calisthenics and spirituality and, so there was never a pure authentic, but it is easier for those communities to point to exactly where they come from, where like in the, average like yoga nomad, if you will, has multiple teachers and multiple gurus. You also, I think, have to layer that with another, historical issue of like what happened with the whole guru culture, and when you had Jim Jones, and you had the gurus coming over, and you had these lineages that people were following, and then you had basically society freaking out and saying all gurus are bad, So I think, and I'm totally digressing from your original question now, but I don't think that there's more true yoga, but there are lineages that hold true to the form that it came over from originally from whoever it started.
Well, so the complicating factor to that, right, is so this language of talking about yoga as something that kind of travels and morphs, right? It presupposes that there is an actual thing, right, called yoga that, yes, came from India, right, and then traveled over, it was imported, right, it was variously enacted, right, and right, goes around kind of changing and adapting to its context. What that ignores, right, so again, this is kind of just where my head is at because this is what I've been writing about, is that in all of these places, and now I'm generalizing, right, so I imagine in all these places, like it would be interesting to look at like how yoga kind of happens in Japan, right, and what that's sort of overriding to some extent. But just based on my work in North America, right, there are things, if we look back 100 years, that we can look at people doing kind of mindful like breath and movement, right, that are not called yoga, but that are accomplishing something very similar, right, and that yoga, right, as it's coming over from India via all these lineages and these early transnational yogis, is sort of imposing itself upon, right, and they're blending together. But there's always that pre-existing thing there, right? And so to talk about kind of, I don't know, Indian yoga as more traditional yoga, right, or more yogic, and to some extent is true, right? Because there we can find actual traditions that were called yoga, more than 100 years ago. Did they look like what we call yoga today, right? I mean, that's a little bit iffier. So if you want to trace just the term yoga, right, historically, genealogically, you can do that, right? And then yes, it does come from India. But then the massive stuff that we refer to as yoga today, right, and what, yoga and vineyards and death metal yoga is based on. Like there's other ingredients there, right? I think it's maybe more accurate to say that yoga kind of coalesces, right, in various places in various ways, rather than thinking about it as one thing that travels, right? Like it's more. I think it's more like an emergent thing, maybe.
The rhizome.
Yes. Yeah, I'm like subconsciously riffing on your metaphor there.
It's fine. Here's one of my Yeah, but yeah, the idea, one of the ways that I talk about it is like, it still loses metaphor, yeah. And so I use Deleuze in my dissertation and talk about methodology, especially yoga methodology, as this like, rather than being like a hierarchical tree structure model, it's more of a rhizomatic model, rhizomes being weeds, right? And so it moves in ways where, yes, it plants itself underground, and then some pieces come up with very strong weeds, and then some are little weeds, and so it's there and it's connected, but it's not in ways that look or feel that are super tangible necessarily from the surface.
I'm talking about inosculations of rhizomes now. That's my new thing. I've wedded our metaphors.
Love it. But does that make sense? The rhizome metaphor, as far as
Yeah.
So everything. Anyway.
in a way, and that's
which
where
makes it very difficult for the yoga alliance.
which makes it very difficult, which is why you need a standardized curriculum. Yeah, right, which does. And that's where we've come up in the past, especially recently, because you'll get yoga teacher training programs that are including juicing and mala making as part of the yoga teacher training program. And it's like, yes, they might be related in some way to yoga, but that is definitely not, so figuring out where the lines are too, like, there's boundaries. It's just like a fence with very open slats.
Question. Does Yoga Alliance look in any way at the Common Yoga Protocol?
The common yoga protocol?
Yeah, India's Common Yoga.
Yeah, we've been having conversations with, Well, and Satbir, the guy that I mentioned earlier, he was actually with Baba Ramdev a couple weeks ago, which was interesting, just having a conversation with him about that. We're also looking, because there's the Australian Yoga Alliance.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So, there are other standardization bodies, but...
Or are there other yoga alliances around the world?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. So oh no, you go ahead.
So, what constitutes a standard practice for
It's
Yoga Alliance?
it's like what I was mentioning earlier when we think about, how do you get to that even place of some sort of standard for what one needs to become a teacher, like how many hours. The way that it came about was in 1999 at a Yoga Journal conference. There was all of these rumors, and it was about to happen essentially, that there would be yoga teacher trainings that could happen on the weekends like they are for fitness trainings. And so these yoga teachers that cared deeply about their practice were all like, we can't let this happen, what can we do? And so they decided to create an alliance of teachers, and then they were like, okay, well, what are we going to make within that? And so most of them had traveled to India to be with their teachers in order to become teachers, and so they were like, well, 3 months in India is about 200 hours. And so the idea that was like the first step on your path to becoming a teacher was to take that first 200 hours, and within that 200 hours you get a real foundational knowledge, but then you have to continue that path forever, and according to yoga for multiple lifetimes, in order to actually, walk it fully. But just thinking about what should be the standard and how should it change and how should it look in relationship to history and context, and also what are we actually teaching, right? Because in the West, especially, an average yoga class is not you going in and practicing an hour of pranayama and then sitting there and meditating and then maybe doing some kriyas, and then that's 90% of yoga in the U.S. is asana based. So it's also like, how do you create responsible teachers if that's what yoga looks like today too? So it's like, again, you have to. Everything is complicated.
And of course, it's always arbitrary.
And arbitrary. Right, like just that story. Like, they were like, I don't know, 200 hours sounds about right. And then that becomes the de facto model. 20 years later, we're like, is 200 hours even responsible? But it's like, what do you know? So it's, there's lots of thinking and talking to people and trying to say that there are standards, but we have to be fluid, just like yoga is fluid with what those look like, and always continue to question and complicate and problematize, as well as streamline and give some sort of basic parameters so that we're not having juicing as part of a 200-hour teacher training program.
That's how institutions are maintained.
Yeah.
Rules.
Right. Rules and boundaries, and scope of practice, we talked about too, like, what is your scope of practice after 200 hours, right? You are not actually qualified after 200 hours to go be teaching to students dealing with complex trauma. You were not trained in that 200 hours to do that. And so getting really clear about what that looks like. What are you trained to do at the most foundational level? And you give a safe, effective, hopefully non-threatening, non-oppressive yoga class.
Well, that's what's interesting about it, right? Like, based on just where I'm at with thinking about yoga, it's
it doesn't seem so absurd to me that juicing would somehow like kind of be in that space, right? But I think when you're talking about it on an institutional level and setting standards, right, given how little 200 hours actually is.
Right, there's not space for juicing.
Yeah, it's not that you shouldn't do the juicing, right? Like that might be very central to how you do yoga at your studio.
I love my juice.
Right.
Yes.
but like, yeah, is that at the core of like what you need to be a responsible teacher who doesn't hurt people?
And I think that I will argue that there is a core that, I mean, I know that we just said you can't really define yoga, but I think within that context, there is a space of definitional, like there is a history to it, there is a philosophy to it. We have bodies, they have anatomy. There's certain anatomy that one should know to create a safe, effective yoga class, right? There are ethics that we need to be aware of when we hold the space of a teacher. You know, like those are important to think about, and those can also be, to a certain extent, standardized, with always space for new voices and new thoughts, and for us to get it a bit wrong, right? And to continue to have these conversations about, like, does the standard stay the same? Do we need to elevate the standard? Is this what the core curriculum? I mean, I think rather than the last 20 years where they set standards and then they kind of forgot about it, I think that that's not very responsible for us to do going forward with yoga, especially considering how popular yoga is. And they're saying, you know, for every yoga teacher, there's 3 more people that want to become yoga teachers. That, like I said earlier, it's grown 50% every year for the last 5 years. We know that 15% of the U.S. population is now practicing yoga, which 15% of an entire population doing anything is fairly massive. Yeah. So, like, we have to think about what, like, this is happening. And how are we responding to it?
I'm interested, so as yoga emerges as a practice, we're saying it's growing, and we're saying there's a certain social responsibility to it, and a certain self-empowerment. As people that study yoga as a religious practice, how do you see it either replacing or not replacing or interacting with current religious institutions that are in place, such as church attendance, or mosque or synagogue? How do you see yoga as competing almost with the way that organized religion exists in America specifically?
I mean, I don't think it's a new phenomenon necessarily. I think that the extent to which we've kind of privatized religion, right, and we've decoupled religious institutions from state institutions, that's not absolutely true, obviously, right, but to the extent that we like to at least pretend that that's true, it's maybe more visible now, right, that people, like the spiritual but not religious stuff is a thing, right, we talk about secularism. People are sort of more visibly seeking out religion and spirituality in places that are not kind of like traditionally institutional, right? That are not the church or the temple or the mosque. But in a sense, and this is where it's really interesting to me to look at what came before yoga in kind of a North American or a European context. This stuff that's kind of at least like liminal to the institution has always existed, right? There were always practices that were borderline heretical. There were always practices that just didn't quite fit into the religion box, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that it's not that what's happening is new, right? It's just that it's happening in different ways because it's kind of responding to a different set of social cultural contexts. So I don't know that like it's weird to think about yoga as like kind of intentionally and actively and agentively competing with organized religion, right? I think it's more that it kind of fills this space that exists because of various interlocking social factors, right? That sort of, again, it's creating this opportunity for people to, in a neoliberal spiritual marketplace, right, to pursue this kind of stuff.
Well, and a lot of people are like, they're calling it yoga church, and there is a real thing about community building in those spaces rather than people going to more traditional religious institutions to find community.
And of course, there's a lot of overlap.
And there's a ton of overlap, yeah.
There's a lot of Christian yoga,
holy yoga,
Islamic yoga. Then of course, praise moves, right? And then of course, some people are doing yoga in church, and then some people are not going to church on Sunday, but they're going to yoga class, but that doesn't mean they don't call themselves Christians. So this is the problem with quantitative studies that try to capture religion and spirituality, is that they really lack nuance in thinking about the ways in which religion is done. And so a lot of these questionnaires that try to capture these statistics will say, are you religious, or are you spiritual, or are you neither? But what about spiritual and religious, right? Like how, why are these things incompatible? I think in most consumers' lives in the 21st century, especially among the middle and upper classes, these are very much compatible, and people are both being religious and being spiritual, in new and interesting ways.
Well, my undergrad students put their fingers on this very quickly, right? Like it's so obvious to them that you can be both of these things. You can be one but not the other, or like whatever, right? And it's just I wish Q would wrap their heads around that.
When they have to fill out the questionnaire, they tick a box. Because you gotta tick a box.
That gets into the politics of data collection.
Yeah, it's really, I think, deeply flawed when it comes to religion.
I think zooming it out, though, beyond America, you look at Islamic countries, for yoga to work there, it's classified as a sport. Right?
Sport?
Yeah, like in Iran, yoga is considered a sport. Otherwise it would be haram, and it wouldn't fly.
Well, and in China, they have a whole yoga commission now that they're talking about how they can basically, they're like, okay, we can use yoga and say that it's secular, or it may be spiritual, but mostly secular, and then also infuse Chinese values and Chinese history into yoga, and then have a whole governmental program to promote it. So that's an interesting overlap. And,
So China's now like the global yoga superpower. Economically speaking.
Economically, they have I think they have like 14,000 studios at this point.
Yeah. But interesting, most of the people doing yoga in China are doing it at home.
Well, and there is no standard there either. So you're also having people that are like, I took ballet once, teaching the yoga classes and stuff like that. So it is a really interesting. They're very concerned right now with how they standardize yoga, but make sure that it's through a Chinese lens and make sure that the government is involved. So
and it doesn't turn into another Falun Gong.
No, they're terrified about Falun Gong. Yeah.
But yoga's so decentralized.
But that's why they like it. So they're like, we don't
people.
have a leader, you don't have one text, you don't have, and so therefore it doesn't have the problematics that some other religious or spiritual institutions.
Hot tip though, if you want to make money in yoga, don't teach yoga classes, invest in spandex. Or the material that goes into yoga mats. Because actually there's more value in accoutrements. If you break down gym memberships and attending a casual class compared to how much money is generated through clothing and mats, it's like 3/4, something like that. It's the accoutrements. So sell more yoga blocks.
High pillows.
Or invest in the rubber.
The yoga wheels are really big. Tatami yoga mats.
Tatami.
Yeah, it's no longer rubber there. In Japan, they started tatami yoga mats.
Because they're sustainable.
Yeah.
It just smells like this.
We probably have time for maybe one last question from the floor, if anyone has a question, or a question from the panel, or something pressing. Yeah.
So the word heretical has been, in my mind, this sort of, not negative, different than negative. Negative is too general, but the way that I've heard it been used in conversation today has been almost benign or casual or almost positive. I'm just wondering, what is heretical, heretic, heresy, if yoga encourages it or enables it, or if that's what we want or encouraging. I don't know what your perspective is on the word heretical and the way
The word heretic means to choose, right?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. So maybe my association.
No, but in like traditional like Christian, to be a heretic was a very bad thing because you don't want to choose; you want to follow.
Yeah, but I think we're all.
But not talking about it that way.
Up here, humanities scholars are trained in social sciences humanities, and that itself, people who are drawn toward the humanities and social sciences tend to be less conventional, I think, or like open to unconventional things and ideas. So I think that might be what you're picking up on is this sort of ambivalence toward the category of heretic, because we're all inclined to sort of understand the ways in which these categories are usually exercised as means of consolidating power, orthodox and heretic, and we're sort of, we see the problems with that. And so we have a certain kind of distance when it comes to these terms and like a tendency not to use them in those ways, kind of in the same way that religion scholars tend to have a distance from the category of cult. So whereas it's used in popular culture in this sort of derogatory way to put down a community, like, oh, well, that's just a cult. Scholars of culture will oftentimes not use it this way. We'll use it in a more ambivalent way. It's a cult in the sense of, a community of people organized around some kind of devotional practice or devotional object. And I think that's maybe what you're picking up on is this sort of
detachment from judgment.
Yeah.
From the word.
Yeah.
I think there's that, and I think to the extent that maybe I'll just speak for myself. I don't want to rope you into this as a fellow scholar practitioner. As somebody who would maybe locate herself within like non-institutional forms of like North American spirituality, right? I think like we also maybe fancy ourselves to be a little like countercultural, right? And so to be historically, right, what does it mean to be a heretic? It means to kind of transgress orthodoxy, right? And I mean, in whatever way that would have looked, right? I mean, some heresy is actually profoundly boring if you look at what qualified from a historical perspective. But I think there's this kind of maybe even more personal sense of kind of how power is consolidated, right, and resisting the consolidation of that power.
Yeah, I think it gets to
and stepping outside of it.
Yeah, sorry I interrupted. But I was just saying it gets to our own political commitments.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Question.
Well, I think that's about all the time we have. So thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks to all of you.
Thank you. Wow.
So,
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. Stay tuned for more episodes. In the meantime, please have a look at the Yogascapes in Japan website at yogascapesinjapan.com. Also, if you're feeling generous, please think about making a donation through the GoFundMe account linked to the website. Until next time.